Thank you so much for sitting down with me today, Stacey. I would love for you to just introduce yourself to everyone and tell us a little bit more about your teaching journey.
Yeah, so my name is Stacey Lloyd. I was born in Zimbabwe. I did all my primary school years in India. I was at boarding school in the UK for high school. And then when I came to doing university, I chose to go to Cape Town, South Africa. And that's when I trained to be a teacher. And I began my teaching years at a school in Cape Town and lived and worked there for about 10 years. And then I moved to Vancouver, Canada, and also worked as a teacher there for years. And now I live in Edinburgh, Scotland. So quite an international story, but one which I think education has been the sort of common thread throughout. And it's given me this really diverse view of what it means to sort of be a learner in different cultures and communities and different ways of learning around the world.
Tell us a little bit more about what made you decide to become a seller on TPT.
Yeah, so when I actually moved to Vancouver, I moved to Vancouver after being years of a classroom teacher and loving being a high school English teacher. But we moved for my husband's further studies, and the visa I was given just meant that I wasn't able to teach for the first year because I didn't have the right qualifications yet. And that was incredibly frustrating for me. I was desperate to be in the classroom. But funny enough, I ended up working with an NGO which needed curriculum developed for some of the work they were doing back in schools in South Africa, which was very much what I knew. And so I spent about 4 months designing materials for other teachers to use. And it just ignited this real passion in me for combining sort of the academic rigor and what I knew to be good practice with a newfound love of graphic design and sort of packaging things in ways which teachers could understand. And so when that work came to an end, I was just like, this is something I could really do more of. And I literally just Googled selling curriculum online. And we're talking over a decade ago now. And so Teachers Pay Teachers was still in the earlier days. It was a very different looking marketplace. Of course, I came across the articles about Deanna Jump and I thought, what have I got to lose? Let me give this a go. And so spent a couple of months actually designing materials to put online. And then it took off from there and I absolutely loved it. And even when I went into the classroom after that, it really enhanced both areas. And I've been doing it ever since.
Where do you draw that inspiration from when you create your resources?
I think this is such a great question because I think it has to come from firstly what works well in my own classroom. Like I think that I draw inspiration from students I know, from working in classrooms, from what has sort of ignited a love in my own classroom practice that kind of I pour into the resources I create. But I also think that one of the places I draw most inspiration from is, this is going to sound strange, but every time I meet somebody new at a dinner party or an event or something, and you tell them you're an English teacher, and I'm sure many English teachers can relate to this, you often get a response like, oh, I hated Shakespeare in school, or, oh, I hated learning about poetry. And those are my niche. That's where on Teachers Pay Teachers, I love creating Shakespeare resources and literature resources. And I think every time I have that response from someone, it inspires me more because I want to make sure that there are less students out there with that experience. And so I want to create materials which really give teachers the tools to do what they do best, but with the right materials to make sure that there are no more students out there hating literature. And that I find is actually quite a good source of inspiration.
You know, as you're creating these resources and thinking about all the different ways that you can keep that love of literature alive, get students engaged, what steps are you taking to ensure that they're working for teachers and for students in the classroom?
That's such a good question because I think that the diversity of experience I've had in classrooms is kind of it just always reminds me that there's no one way to learn. There's no one approach, that every single classroom is a wonderful interaction of a unique teacher with their own unique magic that they bring to the classroom and a unique group of students in a very unique context. And so, you know, in that way, it's actually quite hard to create materials that would work everywhere for every classroom. And I think that what I try to do though is provide teachers with a lot of flexibility and a lot of ability to adapt to their own style and their own classroom. You know, every time I'm designing a lesson plan for a teacher, I really try to put multiple options of activities or multiple options of assessment or, you know, give tips and ideas to make it applicable to their own context. And I think that that's really key to make sure that it's working for a variety of possible contexts and students. Sometimes the best feedback I can get on a unit is, wow, there's more material here than I I would ever use, because I think that means that there's enough to pick and choose from to make it adaptable. At the end of the day, the teacher's the best person placed to teach their own unique students. And I can only just provide the tools, and I want to give them sort of a range of tools to pick from so that they can find what works for them. I've even had a couple of pieces of feedback recently on units. I had teachers sort of say to me, wow, having taught this unit, it's inspired me to create my own for X, whatever text that they're teaching. And I actually, although it's kind of working me out of selling resources, I love that. I love that kind of, maybe it's allowed them to, giving them some ideas for lesson plans or types of materials to use to go and create something else that works for their students and the texts that they're going to love that I don't have materials for. So I think that's really key.
Yeah. And I think that's really great to hear because, one of the special things about TPT, there is this sharing of ideas and wisdom and expertise with one another. And it's what makes selling on TPT and the community so special.
Absolutely. Yeah.
How has being a TPT seller influenced your own teaching in your own classroom?
So often when we're teaching, there's so much to the busyness of the day-to-day of teaching that we get quite bogged down in just surviving day by day. And as much as we would love to kind of step outside of that and have a much bigger view, I know from my own experience, when I've got just today's lesson to get through and all the grading and the lesson planning and trying to keep up with the next day, it can be really overwhelming. And I think that since selling on Teachers Pay Teachers, when I come to designing a unit, I do what's probably best practice and we all should be doing, but we just don't have the time in reality. And that is kind of the big picture thinking, right? It's the backwards design. It's the sort of going, what are my end goals? How can I really work backwards from that? How can I create a unit which really builds towards the final assessment? Because if I'm going to create a unit to sell online, that actually has to all be done. And I think that's reminded me in my own teaching practice how to do that and not just sort of day by day sort of surviving, which is totally understandable.
Totally understandable if you're just surviving. But
absolutely. I think that's also why TPT is so great as a community and place to buy resources from other teachers who have done some of that big picture thinking so that you can actually just provide incredible day-to-day lessons that I think it's a great help.
You've been on TPT for a while. Any advice you have to give to those sellers who are looking to connect with their customers and grow their businesses?
I mean, in terms of growing the business, it has to just start with the content and the product. I think that before you can even think about anything else in terms of marketing or connecting with buyers and everything, just creating great content is key, and keep creating great content because that is what will be the most successful. And then I think it really has to be what works for you and what brings you a lot of joy, because as you say, I've been doing this for a very long time now, and I've seen everything come and go from all the ways that, people are saying you have to have a blog, and I never had a blog, and you have to do X, Y, and Z. And I have tried my hand at some of them and it just hasn't felt natural to me and it hasn't felt authentic to me. And I think that buyers and fellow teachers, they'll pick up on that and they'll notice. And so I think that you have to find what works for you and what's authentic to you. I now write a newsletter, which has been so life-giving for me, and I love it. I actually sit down to write the newsletter and it brings me so much joy, and I share what I'm reading and I share some of the academic research I'm doing and try and find ways to put it into practice for teachers. And I don't do a lot of selling through the newsletter, but I've definitely connected with buyers because I love it. And so if you love doing reels on Instagram and that's going to connect you with buyers and fellow teachers, do it. But if that's not you and it doesn't feel right to you, find what does. Maybe it is a sort of a newsletter or Facebook posts and a community there. Yeah, definitely find what works for your personality. That'll be the best way to build community.
What's a life lesson that you have learned from being a seller?
Being a TPT seller has already given me is a confidence, a self-confidence that I didn't have before, because I think that when you create something and you put it out there into the world and somebody buys it and then they leave feedback and say, wow, this really saved me time, or it really worked well with my students, or my students gained a new skill, that kind of confidence boost is really amazing. And I think that it's really given me a confidence in that way, which has been really valuable. I also think, though, that it's given me a self-confidence that I never thought I would sort of run my own small business. And, if you'd asked me as a teacher 10, 15 years ago when I started teaching, would you ever open your own business, I'd have been like, gosh, no, never. I don't have the skills for that at all. And yet now if I look back on my journey as a TPT seller, and I've learned so much about Facebook marketing and graphic design and creating products and customer service and doing my taxes and incorporating and loads of these things that I've just learned along the way, I actually feel quite proud of that. And I feel like, yeah, I could open another small business if I ever wanted to one day.
Do you feel like it's made you more confident in like your teaching abilities in the classroom as well?
I think it has. Even actually going for job interviews, being able to kind of point to sort of the resources I've created and what thousands of other teachers have said about them. It's kind of a really great confidence boost.
That's a pretty excellent selling point.
Yeah.
What's your favorite thing about being a part of the TPT community?
Being a part of the TPT community has been really incredible, seeing how encouraging people are and how many incredible cheerleaders there are out there. And I never thought that I would have this amazing international group of teachers. You know, I've made friends with teachers all over the world, and people that I've connected through, you know, in the early days through the forums, having gone to a couple of conferences and met people in real life has been so much fun. But more than that, it's been so encouraging. You know, people are so willing to share ideas and information and help each other out. I mean, we're all teachers, and so sort of feedback is in our nature. And I think that that's been a really wonderful part of the community for sure.
Who are some other sellers that you admire?
There are so many. I mean, there are like hundreds of incredible sellers, thousands of incredible sellers on TPT. But I think if I were to just sort of two that come to mind in my sort of subject area, Addie Williams. When I joined TPT, she was one of the first people to welcome me and offer help and advice and actually offer to meet in real life, and has since just become a very dear friend. But to be honest, I think she's just forever championing everyone else and cheerleading and just being a really great friend. So Addie Williams, yeah, she's just phenomenal. And the other one I would say is the daring English teacher, who is, again, has become a friend in real life. But to be honest, for years, I just sort of admired her from afar because her output on TPT was not only phenomenal in terms of just amount, but I've used so many of her resources in my own classroom because they're just full of incredible rigor and brilliant ideas and useful time-saving materials. And so I think I really admire how she just keeps at it and how she works incredibly hard and creates such brilliant materials.
Thanks so much for joining us and for sharing your journey and what inspires you and motivates you.
Absolutely. It's been fun to think about.